You have used a phrase your whole life without knowing you were naming a real street in a real town. A street where giant trees were dragged down a greased track by teams of oxen to a screaming steam saw on the edge of the sea. The phrase is Skid Row. When we say a man has ended up on Skid Row, we mean the bottom, the district of the down and out, the end of the line. But Skid Row is a worn-down version of an older phrase, Skid Road, and Skid Road was not a metaphor. It was a literal road, built of logs laid crosswise and slicked with grease, and the most famous one in America ran straight down a muddy hillside in a tiny frontier settlement on Puget Sound called Seattle, down to the waterfront sawmill of a man named Henry Yesler in the 1850s. Every time an American says Skid Row, they are speaking, without knowing it, the name of that road, and remembering, without knowing it, the men who worked it. And that is the thing that pulls at me about this story. The phrase survived. The men did not. We know the name of Yesler, who owned the mill, and we know the names of the town founders, men like David Denny, who as a young man did the raw labor of drawing the logs into the saw. But the ox team drivers who walked beside those straining animals in the mud, and the Duwamish men, the people whose land this was, who worked that mill and that waterfront by the dozen, those men left us a phrase and almost nothing else. Their names were not written down. This is the story of Seattle's Skid Road, how a wall of the largest trees on earth was pulled down to the water by hand and by ox, and how the men who did it gave the English language a phrase they would never be paid for and never be thanked for. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button, come back. Because this is a story hiding inside a word you already know, and once you hear it, you will never say that word the same way again. To understand why a sawmill rose in the wilderness of Puget Sound at all, you have to look about 1,000 miles south to California and back a few years, to 1848 when they found gold. The gold rush did not just fill California with men digging for metal. It filled it with men who needed somewhere to live, and San Francisco exploded almost overnight from a village into a city that had to be built, board by board, out of wood. And California did not have anywhere near enough good timber close at hand to feed that hunger. But the Pacific Northwest did. Up along the coast of what would become Washington, the land met the sea in deep, safe harbors, and right down to the edge of the water grew some of the greatest forests that have ever existed on this planet. Mile upon mile of Douglas fir and red cedar, trees that had been standing since before the fall of Rome, some of them well over 200 feet tall, and so thick through the trunk that a whole family could not have joined hands around one. I want to make you feel that forest, because it is almost impossible for us to picture now, having never seen it. This was old growth, in the true sense, a forest that had never been cut, that had been growing and dying and regrowing on that coast for thousands of years. The Douglas firs were among the tallest trees on Earth, straight columns rising 100, 150, more than 200 feet before the first branch, their trunks 6, 8, 10 feet and more across at the base. Mixed among them stood the western red cedars, some even broader, trunks that could measure close to 20 feet through, trees already ancient when the first Europeans reached the continent. The forest floor beneath them was dim and cool and deep with the fallen needles of centuries. A single one of these trees held a staggering amount of wood, enough to frame many houses, and it had taken the better part of 1,000 years to grow it. To a millman looking for lumber, this was not a forest. It was a bank vault, standing full, right at the edge of a deep water harbor, and that is exactly how it was treated. The very thing that made these trees so valuable, their enormous size, was also what made them so hard to handle, because there was no machine on that frontier that could pick up or carry a log that big. The size that made them worth a fortune was the same size that made moving them by muscle and animal alone one of the hardest problems in early American industry. Everything about the skid road, the grease skids, the long ox teams, the whole strange system existed because of the sheer, almost unbelievable scale of what these men were trying to move. They were not hauling logs. They were hauling the biggest living things in North America, one at a time, down a hill to the sea. So a simple and enormously profitable idea took shape. Cut that timber, mill it into lumber, and ship it south to the endless building sites of San Francisco. All you needed was a harbor deep enough for ocean ships, a forest coming right down to the shore, and a mill to turn logs into boards. Puget Sound had the harbors and the forest in abundance. What it did not yet have, in most places, was the mill. And into that gap, in the autumn of 1852, stepped Henry Yesler. Yesler was not one of the young dreamers who had founded the little settlement of Seattle the year before. He was a millwright, a practical man who knew steam engines and saws, and he came to Puget Sound looking for the right spot to build a steam-powered sawmill, which was a more advanced and powerful thing than the small water-powered mills scattered around the Sound. The tiny community of Seattle wanted him badly, because a mill meant work and money and a future, and the settlers arranged for him to have a strip of waterfront and a claim running back up the hill behind it. That strip, that connection between the timbered hillside and the deep water, was the whole key. Yesler had ordered his mill machinery all the way from the East Coast. It included a steam engine of about 12 horsepower, a boiler, and a great circular saw around 48 inches across, a spinning steel disc 4 feet in diameter, and it had left New York by ship back in the spring of that year for the long voyage around the tip of South America. A steam mill was a genuinely important thing to have, and it is worth understanding why. Most of the early sawmills on Puget Sound ran on water power, driven by the flow of a stream or a river, which meant they had to be built wherever the water was and could slow or stop when the water did. A steam mill was free of that. It could be built anywhere you could bring logs and ship out lumber, right on the deep harbor, and it could run as hard as you could, feed it fuel and logs. That is why the little settlement of Seattle wanted Yesler so badly that they rearranged their own land claims to give him the waterfront strip he needed, the strip that ran from the timber down to the water. They understood that a steam sawmill was not just a business. It was the seed of a city, and Seattle was far from alone in the ambition. That same year, 1853, the newspaper of record on the Sound reported that 14 sawmills were already operating around Puget Sound, and within a few years there would be more than 24. The whole coast had caught the same fever, the understanding that the wall of timber at the water's edge could be turned into money in the building yards of California. Seattle's mill was one of many. What made it matter was that it was the first steam mill on the Sound, and that the town which grew around it would, in time, outgrow all the others. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. By the end of October 1852, the mill was under construction on the Seattle waterfront, and in the last days of March 1853, Yesler fired the boiler, brought the great saw up to speed, and cut the first lumber. It was, by his own later account, the first steam sawmill ever built on Puget Sound. He said it plainly, "My mill was the first steam sawmill put up on the Sound." Now, I want to be honest about the mill itself, because the truth is more human than the legend. It was not a marvel of precision. It could cut somewhat less than 14,000 board feet of rough lumber in a day, and Yesler himself admitted, in later years, that a great deal of that early lumber was of poor quality. This was not a cathedral of industry. It was a rough, smoking, screaming machine on the edge of a frontier bay, worked by a handful of men, turning the biggest trees in the world into boards. And the work inside that mill was hard and dangerous in its own right. A great circular saw 4 feet across, spinning at speed, driven by steam, is a fearsome thing, and the men who fed logs to it and pulled the cut boards away worked long days right beside it, in the noise and the flying sawdust, with no guards and no safety of any kind, on a wet and slippery floor. The mill ran as many hours as there was daylight and logs and men to run it. Outside, the Puget Sound weather did its part. The long gray rains that soaked the skid road into a slick of mud and cold, month after month in the wet season. There was little comfort in any of it. This was a frontier settlement at the edge of a continent, far from anywhere, and the men lived rough and worked rougher. What held it together was the mill and the wage and the simple fact that the whole tiny town rose and fell on whether those logs kept coming down the hill and those boards kept going out onto the ships. But it was the heart of the town, and everything, the whole life of early Seattle, organized itself around that heart. Because here is the central fact of the whole operation, the problem that the skid road existed to solve. The mill sat on the water where the ships could come. But the trees grew up on the hillside above and behind the town, and every year, as the nearest timber was cut, the tree line receded farther up the slope, farther from the mill. So you had the largest and heaviest objects in the landscape these enormous fir and cedar logs, up on a hill, and you had to get them down to a saw at the water's edge, with no machines to do it, no engine that could move a log, no truck, no crane, no railroad. Just the slope, gravity, animals, and men. The answer they built was the skid road. Let me walk you down that road because the engineering of it, primitive as it looks, was cleverer than it seems. The problem with dragging an object the size of a fir log across bare ground is friction. The log digs in, the earth tears up, and even a long line of oxen cannot move it. The greased skids solved that. By laying those crossbars at regular intervals and slicking their tops, the builders turned a rough hillside into something closer to a prepared track. So the big log rode along the slick tops of the skids, instead of plowing through the dirt. It was, in a rough way, the same principle as a railroad, a prepared, low-friction path for a heavy load. Built decades before any railroad reached that coast, and built entirely out of the forest itself. But it was far from safe. The road ran downhill, toward the water, and a log weighing many tons, once it was moving on greased skids on a slope, wanted to keep moving, and could shift or lurch or slide faster than the team ahead of it. A driver had to manage not just the pulling, but the holding back, keeping an enormous, half-sliding weight under control on a slick, downhill grade, with the animals and the men strung out along a line that a runaway log could turn deadly in an instant. Men were hurt and killed in this kind of work up and down the coast, crushed against skids or caught by logs that got loose. And at the bottom, at the water, came the final act, rolling the great logs off the end of the road and into the bay, where they could be gathered and floated to the mill, or lashed together into rafts and towed to other mills around the sound. The whole system ran on the simplest of ingredients: logs, grease, oxen, gravity, and men willing to walk beside a moving mountain of wood, and it brought the largest timber on earth down to the sea with no engine at all. A skid road was a track, and the road down to Yesler's mill ran along what the settlers called Mill Street, the strip of Yesler's claim that connected the hill to the harbor, the same street that generations later would be renamed Yesler Way. But it was not paved and it was not smooth. To build it, the workers took smaller logs and laid them across the road at regular intervals, set crosswise to the direction the big logs would travel, and half sunk into the mud. Those buried crossbars were the skids. The great fir logs would be dragged along their tops, and to keep the giant logs sliding instead of grinding to a halt, a man went along and slathered the skids with grease. In these Northwest camps, the grease was often just that: animal fat, sometimes bacon grease, anything slick that would let a log slide down the track instead of digging in. Greasing the skids was its own job, done just ahead of the moving log, and it was messy, constant, thankless work. Then there was the power to actually move the logs, and that power was the ox. Teams of oxen, big patient draft animals that the loggers called bulls, were hitched in a long line, one pair behind another, and chained to a log, and driven forward, hauling the log along the grease skids in a process the loggers called yarding, dragging the timber to the mill or to a landing at the water. There were not many oxen in the young settlement, and the story goes that some of the animals used for the earliest hauling had to be borrowed from settlers down in the Puyallup Valley to the south, brought up to do the heavy work of moving those first monster logs. The oxen themselves were a whole economy of muscle that had to be kept alive and fed and matched. A team was not just a set of animals, it was a trained unit that had learned to pull together, to lean into the load on command. And a good team was worth real money and years of patience to build. The animals had to be fed every day whether they worked or not, and in the deep timber that feed had to be brought in. They got sore and sick and injured on the rough ground, and a lame ox was a serious loss. In a settlement as new as Seattle, with only a handful of draft animals to go around, this was a constant strain, which is exactly why they had to reach all the way down to the Puyallup Valley to borrow animals strong enough to move the first great logs. Every part of the skid road depended on those patient, straining beasts, and on the men who understood them, could read their tempers, and could keep a long chained line of them moving as one down a greased and dangerous grade. The man who drove the team was the most important Ebandiz Woods, the one who kept a line of enormous animals pulling together, and getting a log the size of a small house to slide down a muddy hillside without it swinging loose or jamming or crushing someone was a genuine skill and a genuinely dangerous trade. Before I go on, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories unless enough people click. One click. Come back. Because I want to introduce you properly to the men on that road and in that mill, and to the way the whole strange little town revolved around them. The felling itself, up at the tree line, was done entirely by hand, by pairs of men working with axes and the long two-man crosscut saw. To bring down a fir well over 200 feet tall took care and nerve, because a tree that size, falling wrong, could destroy other valuable timber or kill the men working near it, so the fallers had to read the tree and lay it down in exactly the right direction. Once the giant was on the ground, it had to be trimmed of its limbs and cut into lengths a team could handle, and then the real problem began, which was getting that log from where it had fallen, somewhere up in the timber over to the skid road itself. Men worked it with jacks and bars and smaller skids, prying and rolling the log to the prepared track, and only there could the oxen take over for the long pull-down. Every log was a small campaign, from the standing tree to the greased road to the water, and each stage of it was muscle and animal and simple iron tools, with the mill whistle waiting at the bottom of the hill. Once it was down and cut into lengths, the logs went onto the skid road, and the oxen and the drivers took over, walking them down to the water. And working that whole system, in the earliest years, was very nearly every able-bodied man in Seattle. This is one of the details I love most, because it tells you how small and how bound together this place was. Yesler, for several years, employed almost every male settler in the town at one point or another, either out in the woods logging or inside as a mill hand. The whole rhythm of the settlement ran on that mill. When the boiler was fired and the saw was turning, the town had work and money and a reason to exist. When the logs stopped coming down the road, everything stopped. There was no other real industry, no fallback. The men who founded Seattle had not set out to build a mill town on purpose so much as they had gathered around the one enterprise that could turn the endless forest into cash, and that enterprise set the tempo of every life in the place. It bound the settlers together in a way that is hard to imagine now, when a town has 100 employers and a person can change jobs across the street. Here, for a while, there was essentially one job, the getting of logs to the saw and boards to the ships, and nearly every man in town did some part of it. That is why the record can say, without much exaggeration, that Yesler employed almost the whole male population of the settlement. It was not a turn of phrase. For a few years, the town and the workforce of that single mill were very nearly the same group of people, and that included the men whose names we do remember, doing work we would never guess they did. Arthur Denny, one of the leaders of the party that founded Seattle, worked for a long stretch as the screw tender in the mill, operating the mechanism that set the log against the saw. His younger relation, David Denny, another of the founders, worked at drawing the logs in to be cut. The first load of logs for the new mill was furnished by another of the town's founding figures, Dr. David Maynard. Think about that. In a settlement this new and this small, there was no separate class of laborers yet. The men who founded the town, whose names are on the streets and the hills of Seattle today, were the same men who tended the screw and drew in the logs and worked in connection with that mill. The founder and the mill hand were, for a few years, the same person. It is worth knowing what those jobs actually were, because the words sound quaint and the work was not. Arthur Denny, tending the screw, ran the mechanism that gripped the log and drove it forward against the spinning saw, setting how thick each board would be cut, a job that put a man's hands and his full attention right in the path of a 4-foot blade turning at speed. Drawing in the logs, David Denny's work, meant getting the heavy timber up out of the water or off the road and onto the carriage that fed the saw, wrestling waterlogged logs weighing tons into position. The sawyer read the log and guided the cut. The men off-bearing pulled the fresh boards away as fast as the saw threw them, in a constant, hurried rhythm, because the saw did not wait for anyone. It was loud, wet, splinter-filled, dangerous work, done for long hours in a rough building with a boiler hissing at one end and the smell of hot steel and green fur over everything. When the record says a man worked in the mill, that is what it means. Not a clean modern factory. A roaring, primitive, hazardous machine that ate whole trees, tended by men who could lose a hand or worse in a careless second, and who came back and did it again the next day because it was the work the town had. But they were not the only workers, and this is where the record goes quiet in a way I cannot let pass. Yesler's mill, the sources tell us plainly, employed not only almost every white settler, but also a considerable number of Native Americans. This was the land of the Duwamish people and of the related tribes of the Sound, and the man their leader is remembered as Chief Seattle, or Seal, is the man the entire city is named after. The Duwamish and their neighbors worked that mill and that waterfront. They labored in the town that was rising on their own ground, a town named for their own leader. And they were there in numbers, at the mill, on the water, part of the daily work of the place from the beginning. And yet, when I go looking for them in the record, for their names, for their individual stories, for who they were, and what became of them, I find almost nothing. The sources will tell me that Native Americans worked at the mill. They will not, for the most part, tell me a single one of their names. The town took the name of their chief for itself and did not keep the names of the men who helped build it. I want to stay with that a moment longer, because it matters. The 1850s, the very years the mill was roaring and the skid road was busiest, were also the years the native people of the Sound were being pressured off their land. In 1855, just as the town was taking hold, the tribes of the region were brought to sign a treaty that ceded their lands and pushed them toward reservations, even as their labor was helping to build the settler town on the shore. So the Duwamish men who worked at Yesler's mill were doing something almost unbearable to think about clearly. They were helping to cut and mill the forest and build the economy of a town being planted on the very ground being taken from them, a town that had borrowed the name of their leader while offering his people no place in its future. And they were there in real numbers, working the mill, working the water, part of the labor force from the start. The man remembered as Chief Seattle, Seal, whose name the city carries, was a real and respected leader of these people, and his memory has echoed down the years. But the ordinary Duwamish workers, the men who actually put in the days at the mill and on the waterfront, are almost entirely unnamed in what survives. I can tell you they were there. The sources are clear that they were there, in numbers, essential. I simply cannot tell you who they were, one by one, because the people keeping the records did not think their names were worth the ink. Of all the forgetting in this story, that is the forgetting that sits heaviest with me. At the center of all this daily labor stood one building, and it is one of the most charming and revealing structures in the whole history of the American frontier. Yesler built a cookhouse in that first winter of 1852 and 1853 to feed his mill workers. It was just a place to give the men their meals. But in a raw settlement with almost no other buildings, that cookhouse quickly became something far larger than a kitchen. It became the beating social and civic heart of the entire town. The mill workers ate there. But the cookhouse also hosted the first sermon ever preached in Seattle, delivered by a Catholic bishop. It hosted the town's first court case and its first election. Over the next few years, it served at one time or another as the district court, the town hall, the jail, the county offices, a military headquarters, a storehouse, a hotel, a church, and the community's entertainment hall, all in one rough building that had started life as a place to feed the men who worked the saw. Yesler himself lived in it until his wife came out west to join him in 1858. The cookhouse stood at the foot of the Skid Road, and it was the place where the whole town, workers and founders and travelers, and the Duwamish who lived and labored alongside them, came together. It lasted until Yesler tore it down in 1865 to build something bigger. That one building deserves a closer look because it tells you almost everything about how a frontier town was born. When there is only one substantial structure in a settlement, that structure becomes everything by default. The cookhouse was where the mill hands were fed, but it was also, in those first years, the only place large enough to gather in, so every part of the town's public life happened under its roof. The first Christian sermon preached in Seattle was delivered there by a visiting Catholic bishop named Modeste de Mers. The town's first court convened there. Its first election was held there. When there was a prisoner to hold, the cookhouse was the jail. When the county needed offices, when travelers needed a bed, when the community wanted a meeting or a dance or a service of any kind, it happened in that same rough building at the foot of the Skid Road. It was town hall and church and courthouse and inn all at once. I find something telling, and very American, in that. Civilization on that shore did not begin with a capital or a cathedral. It began with a kitchen built to feed the men who worked a sawmill, and everything else, the law, the faith, the government, the whole social life of a future city, grew up around the table where the loggers ate their meals. The heart of the town was, quite literally, the place that fed the workers. One quick note. I turned the full story into a book, Everything the Records Gave Me, If you want it, the link is in the description. Now we come to the strange afterlife of that muddy street. The way it climbed out of the woods of Puget Sound and into the everyday speech of a whole continent. And this is the part almost no one knows. As Seattle grew from a mill town into a real city over the following decades, the area around the old skid road, the low ground near the waterfront where the mill and the cookhouse had stood, changed its character. This was the working part of town, the part full of mills and workers and, over time, the cheap hotels and saloons, and lodging houses that gathered wherever transient laboring men, loggers and sailors and mill hands, came to spend their pay between jobs. It was the district of hard work and hard living. And as the wealthier part of the city moved up and away onto the hills, the old Skid Road area became the place people went when they were down on their luck, the part of town where the poor and the drifting and the broken ended up. There is a physical turn in the story that sealed the district's fate. In the summer of 1889, a fire broke out in the heart of Old Seattle. In the low ground by the water, where the mill and the cookhouse and the foot of the skid road had stood, and it burned the wooden downtown to the ground. The city rebuilt quickly and grandly, but it rebuilt that district in brick and stone, and the neighborhood that rose from the ashes is the one still called Pioneer Square today. And it was precisely this rebuilt core, the old ground down by the water at the base of Yesler Way, that became Seattle's Skid Road in the social sense, the quarter of cheap hotels and saloons and lodging houses where the transient working men gathered, and where, in time, the down and out settled in. So the very same few blocks that had been the birthplace of the town, the site of the mill and the cookhouse and the greased road, became the model of the Skid Road district, the seed of the phrase that would spread across the country. The place where Seattle began and the place that gave the language Skid Row are the same ground. You can walk it today, under the brick fronts put up after the fire, down the slope of Yesler Way toward the water, and stand exactly where the logs once came down and the words were born. And so, the name of the road became the name of a condition. To be on the skid road came to mean to be sliding downward, headed for the bottom, the way a log slid down those greased cross logs toward the mill. The logging term became a social term. Skid Road became the name for that kind of district in city after city up and down the coast, and then across the country. And somewhere along the way, as the phrase spread far from the actual logging country where it was born, the word road wore down into the word row, and Skid Road became Skid Row. By the 1930s, in the depths of the Great Depression, when millions of Americans really had slid to the bottom, Skid Row was the common name. In every city in the nation, for the district of the destitute, almost no one saying it had any idea that they were repeating the name of a specific greased log track in frontier Seattle, or that the sliding they were describing was an echo of a fur log sliding down a hillside toward Henry Yesler's saw. The phrase had traveled so far from its birthplace that it forgot where it came from, the same way it forgot the men who worked the original road. It is worth sitting with how that transformation happened, because it is a small tragedy folded inside a piece of slang. The districts that became known as skid roads were where the working men of the timber economy lived between jobs. Logging and milling and sailing were seasonal, brutal, and unstable. A man would work a camp or a ship until the season ended or the money ran out, and then come to town with his pay and live in the cheap lodging houses and saloons of the low district by the water until it was gone, and he shipped out again. It was a whole culture of transient labor, of men whose work built the region but who owned almost nothing and put down few roots. As the years passed and some of those men grew old or sick or unlucky and could no longer get the work, they stayed on in that district with nowhere else to go, and the neighborhood of working men slowly became the neighborhood of the destitute. City after city on the coast had one, its own skid road down by the mills and the docks, in Seattle and Portland and beyond. The name spread with the pattern. And by the time it had crossed the whole country and settled into the language as Skid Row, it had been sanded down into pure metaphor, a phrase for the bottom of society with no memory left of the greased log track, or the ox teams, or the tall timber, or the hard, rootless men whose lives had worn the meaning into the words. The phrase itself is older and stranger than Seattle, and it is worth being honest about that. Loggers had been talking about skid roads, meaning literal greased tracks for dragging timber, long before Henry Yesler ever reached Puget Sound. The practice of laying and greasing skids to move logs goes back a long way, and the term traveled with it. What Seattle added was not the invention of the words, but the welding of a place to a meaning. because Yesler Way was the most famous skid road of them all, running right through the heart of a city that grew huge. And it was the district around that particular road that became the model for the social sense, the down-and-out quarter. Historians will argue about exactly which city first used skid road to mean a rough part of town rather than a logging track, and the honest answer is that the meaning grew up in several Timber Coast cities at once. But Seattle and Yesler Way sit at the center of the story, the clearest and most famous example, the place most people point to when they ask where the phrase was born, and whatever the precise first use, the deeper truth holds. The words come up out of the logging life, out of grease and oxen and tall timber, and they carry that vanished world forward into the speech of people who have never seen a skid in their lives. You can still go to the place. The heart of Old Seattle, the ground at the foot of the original skid road, is the neighborhood now called Pioneer Square, and Yesler Way, the street that was once Mill Street, once the skid road, still runs down the hill to the water exactly where the logs came down. You can stand on it. And if you know the history, you are standing on the birthplace of a word that half the country uses without a second thought. The mill, meanwhile, did exactly what it was built to do. The lumber it cut, rough and imperfect as much of it was, went out onto ships and down the coast and helped build the booming cities of the West. The lumber schooners came up empty from San Francisco and went back down riding low with Puget Sound boards, and the boards became the houses and the wharves and the storefronts of a coast that was filling up faster than it could build. Seattle timber and the timber of 100 mills like Yesler's quite literally framed the growing West, one shipload at a time, and the appetite for that lumber only grew. What had begun as boards for Gold Rush San Francisco became boards for the whole rising Pacific world, for the towns and farms and ports spreading up and down the coast and inland as the country pushed west. Puget Sound timber went out by the endless shipload, and the mills multiplied and grew larger and cut faster, and the whole region reorganized itself around the trade, around getting the great trees down to the water and the boards out to the market. Yesler's little mill, cutting its imperfect 14,000 feet a day, was the small beginning of what would become one of the mightiest timber industries on Earth, an industry that would define the Pacific Northwest for 100 years. It all traced back to the same simple chain that ran down Mill Street in the 1850s. A tree, a skid road, an ox team, a saw, a ship. The scale would grow beyond anything those first workers could have imagined. But the basic idea, and the basic muscle it was built on, started right there, on the greased road down to Henry Yesler's saw. Yesler grew wealthy. He went on to build a long wharf out into the bay, to invest in the growing town, and to become one of its leading citizens, a rich and prominent man who would even serve as mayor, his name fixed permanently on the street that had been the skid road. The millwright who came to the frontier with a steam engine and a saw ended his life as a pillar of the city he had helped to seed. Seattle grew with him, from a settlement of a few families around a smoking mill into one of the great cities of the Pacific. And the forest that made it all possible, that ancient wall of 200-foot firs and cedars that had come right down to the shoreline, retreated up the hills and then over them and then was, in great measure, simply gone, cut, and milled and shipped away, the way the old growth all along that coast would go in the decades that followed. The trees that had stood for 1,000 years and more built a city in a single human lifetime. And that is a thing worth pausing on, because it happened so fast. The trees that came down that skid road had taken 500, 800, 1,000 years and more to grow. They had been standing since before Columbus crossed the ocean, some of them since before the Norman conquest of England, a few since before the fall of the Roman Empire. And they were cut, and milled, and shipped, and gone in a matter of decades. A forest that had built itself over 1,000 years was converted into the lumber of a booming coast inside a single human lifetime, and it does not grow back on any time scale a person can wait out. The great old-growth wall that had come right down to the shore of Puget Sound, the forest that made Seattle possible, is essentially gone now, surviving only in scattered protected groves where you can walk among a few of the giants that were spared and get the faintest sense of what the whole coast once was. The city stands where the forest stood. The wealth of the trees became the wealth of the town. And the exchange was permanent, a 1,000-year forest traded for a city in the time it takes one man to live and die. I keep coming back, though, not to Yesler and not even to the trees, but to the road itself and the men on it. Picture it at its working height. The wet gray light of a Puget Sound morning, the mud, the smell of grease and cut fur and steam. A single log, a Douglas fir bigger around than a man is tall, chained behind a long line of oxen, sliding and lurching down the greased skids of Mill Street toward the water, with the ox team driver walking alongside in the muck and a man ahead of them slathering the next skids with fat, and the great saw screaming down at the mill, and beyond it the deep water and the ship, waiting to carry the boards to California. And working every part of that scene, the falling and the greasing and the driving and the drawing in and the sawing, a crew of men, white settlers and Duwamish laborers side by side, almost none of whom would ever have their names written into any history at all. That is the thing I want to leave you with. We remember Yesler because he owned the mill. We remember the founders because the town kept their names on its streets. But the bull team drivers who brought the logs down that dangerous grade, and above all the Duwamish men who worked the mill on the land that had been theirs, in the town named for their own chief, those men were the actual muscle of the thing, and the record let them slip away almost without a trace. What they left behind is not a monument. It is a phrase. Skid Row. It is in the mouth of every American, coast to coast, and it will be for as long as English is spoken. And it is, whether we know it or not, their marker, the worn-down name of the greased road they worked, carried down to us across 170 years by people who have no idea whose memory they are keeping. There is something almost unbearable and almost beautiful in that. Most forgotten workers are simply forgotten. Their labor vanishes into the thing they built, and the thing carries no trace of them at all. But these men are different. These men are remembered constantly, every single day, by millions of people, in a phrase so common that we no longer even hear it. And yet the remembering is empty. We say their monument out loud, and we do not know that it is theirs. We keep their memory alive, and we have no idea that we are doing it. It is a strange kind of immortality to have your work preserved in the living speech of a whole nation, while your name and your face and your story are gone, completely. The ox team driver in the Puget Sound mud, the Duwamish man working the mill on his own stolen ground, the greaser slicking the skids ahead of the log, the men who wrestled those enormous logs into the screaming saw, they are all, in that phrase, present every time it is spoken, and not one of them is named in it. I cannot give them their names back. The record did not keep them, and no amount of wanting will undo that. But I can at least tell you that they were real, that they were there, that the words did not come out of nowhere. They came out of them, out of their hands and their animals and their long days of labor on a greased road down to the sea. And maybe that is what these old stories are for. Not to pretend that we can rescue every lost name, because we cannot, but to make sure that when we use the words, "these people left us," we know, at least for a moment, that there were human beings behind them, real men on a real hillside, moving the biggest trees on earth down to the water by hand. That much, at the very least, we can still give them. I think they deserve to have us know. So the next time you hear those two words, remember the ox in the mud, and the fur coming down the hill, and the men whose names the town forgot to write down, even as it kept, in those two small words, the memory of what they did. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from Boss Tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.